afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us. I'm David Sullivan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, an organization that brings together technology companies to identify best practices for what we call trust and safety online. I think one of the topics that has raised itself throughout this summit has been the role of private technology companies and their impact on freedom of expression around the world. And we have really the ideal panel of three of my favorite experts to help us really focus in on that topic, thinking about it in the context of the United States, but also of everywhere around the world, and from thinking about all of the perspectives that have come up during the course of the summit already. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So we have Joan Barata, who is a fellow here at the Future of Freedom of Speech. Jeff Kosseff, also a non-resident fellow, legal fellow here at the Future of Free Speech. And Mishi Choudhary, who is the founder of Software Freedom Law Center India. And really I'm delighted to be speaking with all of you to sort of unpack some of these issues. So I think being very aware that the role of private companies when it comes to facilitating freedom of expression is one that plays out in very different ways in different places around the world. I think it's also worth stating and describing that predominantly at the moment, and this may be subject to change before very long, a lot of the companies we talk about when we talk about social media and other digital products and services are headquartered in the United States, even if they are operating in different places around the world with different consequences. So I thought we'd start with Jeff and to talk a little bit about the state of private regulation of online speech here in the United States, which then has consequences around the world. Jeff, it's quite a tumultuous moment when it comes to regulation of online speech.
That's a kind word.
We have new laws being passed in nearly every state across the country, as well as then litigation that responds to those laws and court decisions that are being issued all the way up to the Supreme Court at all times. What's the current state of speech regulation and regulation of private companies here in the United States, and what's the trend line that we're looking at?
Yeah, so first, I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, in terms of what the current state is, I would say it's not great, it's not terrible, it could be much worse, and I'm a little afraid that it will get worse. So that's the high-level overview. Really what's happening in the United States, you have to first look at which government you're considering, because I think both in terms of the branches as well as state versus federal, you have very different things happening. So if you don't pay attention to what the states are doing, then things look pretty good. But unfortunately, you have to pay attention to what the states are doing. And there's the famous saying that states are the laboratories for democracy. They're also laboratories for incredibly bad tech policy. So we've had a lot of efforts at the states, a lot of experimentation to address what the states think are very real problems. And the courts have been repeatedly coming back and saying, you can't do that because of the First Amendment. So that's a good sign. So I'll give a few examples. One of the most recent examples was part of a series of deepfake-related bills that Governor Newsom had signed earlier this year that prohibit the distribution of certain types of political deepfakes related to the election. A judge very quickly said, no, most of this law is unconstitutional, and enjoined it. And interestingly enough, Governor Newsom also earlier this month ended up vetoing a very sweeping AI regulation bill that would have given the government a kill switch over AI. So that's kind of what's happening in California. We also had we have a number of states that have been passing laws to make the internet safer for children, well-intentioned laws. But they have serious First Amendment concerns, including requiring age verification, limiting the types of content that minors could see. And we've had time and again, we've had federal judges across the United States striking these down. We also had 2 states, Florida and Texas, pass laws that limit the ability of platforms to moderate content, and that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sent it back to the lower courts for a different way to do a First Amendment analysis, but made a fairly strong statement that public-facing social media platforms have a First Amendment right to engage in moderation. And the last thing that I'll just talk about for the introduction would be Section 230. So Section 230 is the law that says that in most cases, online platforms are not legally responsible for the speech that their users create. And it's been fundamental in the business models of platforms for nearly 3 decades now. And members of Congress have been proposing dozens of bills to abrogate the immunity, eliminate it, but that has largely failed. So what you've had instead are judges really showing a frustration with the breadth of Section 230. And we could talk about this later. They really, I think, somewhat out of thin air, have come up with new limits on Section 230. So I think that that really poses a significant threat to the ability of platforms to operate and to be able to provide forums for everyone.
Thanks, Jeff. You've written seminal books about these like core, legal principles and frameworks in the United States, the First Amendment and Section 230. Since those books have been published, we hear increasingly about calls to either repeal Section 230 or that the First Amendment is out of control. And so I do want to come back to some of those ideas a little bit later in the conversation. But I think before we do that, let's take things internationally a little bit. So I want to go first to Joan, who has been a regulator previously and now advises governments in every part of the world when it comes to online speech regulation as well as a human rights-based approach to this. What I wanted to, now outside of the United States, in places where the First Amendment is not part of constitutions and legal frameworks, there have been a lot of fast-moving efforts to regulate social media, but other online digital services. Oftentimes, and perhaps the most notable, fastest moving, and most comprehensive of these is the European Union's Digital Services Act. Proponents of the Digital Services Act will say that the advantage of that approach is that it regulates the systems and processes that companies use as to how they moderate content online rather than regulating content and speech itself. Would love to hear your thoughts on that approach, its pros and cons, and sort of how it is being viewed, both in how it's being implemented in Europe and how it's being viewed around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here in such good company. So indeed, the Digital Services Act was seen and presented as a unique piece of legislation, something that didn't exist anywhere else. And it's true, it's a piece of legislation that regulates platforms, different types of platforms in a very comprehensive manner, and that recognizes, establishes rights for users that had not been established before in such a manner. So that is, a relevant component of the Digital Services Act that has been also appreciated, as I said, in many other parts of the world, and that European politicians are also presenting with pride every time they have the opportunity to do so. This is not only the Digital Services Act, also the Digital Markets Act. It's also presented as an effort to curtail the economic power of big tech, which is also interesting because this is the first time that the big power like the EU is taking an ex-ante approach instead of an ex-post approach. So that is true in this sense. And also, in other parts of the world, as I said, many governments are looking into the Digital Services Act as a possible source of inspiration when considering adopting new laws. And we have seen that in places like Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia. Now I hear that Taiwan is also considering a DSA-like piece of legislation, also in parts of South America. This is not the first time, I must say, because, for example, when Germany adopted the famous NetzDG, which is some sort of a precedent at the national level of the DSA, there was also some interest in other parts of the world. Ironically, authoritarian countries were particularly interested in the NetzDG, as a report by my own project showed at some point. So it's true. I mean, and also, I mean, the propaganda around the DSA says this is about systems and processes, it's not about content. But this is not 100% true. Politicians, or if you listen to EU bureaucrats making presentations about the DSA, this is the first thing that they will say, but it is not completely true. It's true that the DSA for the first time establishes certain obligations in terms of processes, in terms of systems that need to be adopted by platforms in order to better protect users, but at the same time, the DSA has untested provisions that may have a significant impact on speech. And this is something that is often missed when the DSA is presented. Here we can talk about the possibility for platforms to receive orders from judges and authorities with a potential extraterritorial effect. That's a very important thing, I believe. The second thing is the references to fundamental rights as a framework, as a reference for platforms to act that can be easily misused by platforms, by authorities to impose certain criteria when it comes to content moderation, obligations in terms of content moderation. But I would say that the most, for me, the most concerning part refers to the obligation for platforms to assess the systemic risks that they generate and to consequently adopt a series of mitigation strategies to address these risks. Problem here is that the DSA doesn't specify how these risks might be assessed, the nature of these risks that goes beyond what is illegal, and also the kind of measures that should be adopted. And the funny part is that this is some sort of a, let me put it this way, diabolic system, because the DSA says, you platforms, you need to make this assessment. Your platforms are responsible to make this assessment in a proper way. And we, the authorities, will verify if this assessment is correct. On the basis of which criteria? We don't know. Because the European Commission still hasn't issued the criteria according to which risks need to be assessed. No? So in a way, the DSA in these parts refers clearly to content, but what it says is that we European institutions, we don't know exactly how to do it, so that we delegate to platforms the responsibility of doing it and telling them if you don't do it properly, if ex post we reach the conclusion that you didn't do it properly, then you will face responsibilities. So it's some sort of, let's say, a system where everybody's under threat, that there are no clear safeguards, and when it comes to freedom of expression, and where the main concern that has been expressed by some authors like Daphne Keller is that at the end of the day, this may end up in some sort of backdoor agreements, behind the curtains agreements between platforms and regulatory bodies, in the case of big platforms, the European Commission, on how to regulate speech, defining the limits to freedom of expression beyond legal procedures, beyond democratic guardrails. And I think that this is the worst part of the DSA, and unfortunately the part of the DSA that excites other countries the most. And this is the part of the DSA that if we look into some countries that have already incorporated DSA provisions into their legislation, these are the parts that they have taken. No? Say the risk assessments, etc. Even tweaking the DSA even more, because saying your liability exemptions will depend on that, which is something that the DSA doesn't say. But in some cases, for example, in Brazil, this is how it was articulated. So it has good things, but also it has problematic elements. Thank you.
Thank you. And we know very well that whether it is through regulation and the sort of emulation of different laws and regulations in different countries around the world, or whether it is through the application of pressure on companies that operate internationally. What begins in one country does not stay in that country when it comes to the regulation of digital companies. With that, I want to turn to Mishi, who is somebody who has worked on these issues extensively, both here in the United States and in India, to really try to start off by just telling us a little bit more about how you see these pressures and these different regulatory models influencing each other around the world. There is a kind of a narrative that, as Joan said, that the European officials are keen to promote of the so-called Brussels effect. There's also the Sacramento effect that comes up, or Brussels and Sacramento effect combined, when EU and Californian officials work together on these things, that they can create models that can be replicated. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I think there's no one better to tell us about that than you, Mishi.
Thank you. I think I'm going to just say a few things when it comes to numbers, population. India wins all the time. You can't talk about scale and we don't emerge as winners. And second thing, Jeff, you said states as the laboratories for policy. I read it many years ago on Twitter. It's still true. I think India and rest of the world have been watching the same reality TV show. India is just 2 seasons ahead. And we've done it all. We've actually perfected it. You guys just came very late to the party. And when I say we've done it all, meant is that we lived in a world where First Amendment of the United States was an aspiration. For democracies, for other places, this is where we all wanted to land. That's where you could actually mock your politicians. You could come here without the fear. You could say many things, and that's what everyone aspired to do, whether for creation of art, whether for actually criticizing what was happening in their countries. What happened was the internet came into play, and Jeff is an expert on that, and Section 230, which obviously then snowballed into something different. It was ascribed different meanings in different jurisdictions, and that meant that each country then decided to shave on free speech in its own way. Trust and safety, which has now become compliance, whether it is under the DSA or what's happening here, we have already been doing it. It's called censorship by proxy in India, which meant that the government actually comes up with these rules where the companies and the platforms are supposed to take down content and curate per the government's orders, but it's all done behind doors in secrecy. And that means that the government is not censoring you, because that is something you can challenge in courts. But what is happening behind the scenes, and by law, that is supposed to be kept confidential, then you cannot challenge anything. And the companies, now, I think what I would say is that all of us know that a tiny collection of oligarchs control more of the human race's communications than has ever been possible before. They are once again, these days, drawn into kind of confrontations with governments at their expense of the users. We are always at the expense. They will cry my free speech, and that cry actually should only mean my money. And any reference to the free speech is just deception. And amongst the few, the most popular one is, of course, the person who bought what we all know as Twitter. Now, what we've seen is that the primary policy of Elon Musk has, since buying Twitter, has been to trumpet his lawfulness, giving himself noisy credit, following the law wherever he does business. But First Amendment here, something else in Brazil, something else in Turkey, and very, very different in India. I'm going to do exactly what these governments will tell me, but in the United States, I'll yell and scream First Amendment. So what I meant was that having practiced law both in the US and India, I always saw there is this discourse of First Amendment, free speech, and if you regulated platforms, you will A, stifle innovation, and B, its heavens are going to fall. But let's just move to some other place, which people call global south or global majority. Actually, it's the globe because most of the world lives there. But in those markets, which are important markets, really big markets, whether it is WhatsApp, whether it is Twitter, et cetera, in those markets, it was always possible to just forget about this discourse of free speech and expression. The other thing which I'm going to say is that governments in countries like ours, where I think speakers in yesterday and today also talked about, the largest democracy is an electoral democracy, not an institutional democracy. That's India, which is a little different. Yes, we have elections, and because we are so important on the global stage as an anti-China or a counterweight to Russia or whatever is the zeitgeist of the day, that means nobody's going to call out India on anything right now. Since 2012, India has shut the internet 833 times. Audrey just talked about what no access to internet means. This is done by the government legally. 45 times already in 2024, 96 times last year, and 77 times before that. In the height of the pandemic, for 552 days, Jammu and Kashmir had no internet. That's 12 million people. And that's when all of us were living all our lives. We were doing our work, our education, our personal lives through internet. 12 million people had no internet for 552 days. Manipur, a state in Northeast, hasn't had internet for 200 days from April of 2023 to 200 days thereafter. What that meant was it took 78 days for news to travel to the world that women had been raped and they were being paraded naked in that state. That news didn't come up for 78 days. Why I talk about is that because internet shutdowns are the broadest form of what we call here in the United States as prior restraint in First Amendment. It involves the exercise of state power to prevent speech, preemptively doing it. And why this becomes important is because all of this, while it is happening, the companies keep telling us that if there would be any kind of regulation, then free speech gets impacted. Now, people like me are stuck because what happens is that these are also the only platforms where we can actually voice our criticism against our government. But these platforms, when they're hand in glove with our governments, when they're ready to give away our data, and they also take down our content, then we are like, who should we actually trust? We don't have enough local grown platforms precisely for the network effects reasons, which we've talked about earlier. India has great talent, but not an alternative to Twitter or Facebook. And that's how we look at what happens in the world. Joan already talked about DSA. We already did this through subordinate legislation. The notice, consent, the takedown, it's all been in existence for a very long time, and it continues to happen. So for people who want to aspire for that First Amendment, to have that kind of free speech, but being stuck in this rock and many hard places, it becomes a little more difficult to actually take that discourse and apply the same thing in different parts of the world.
Thanks, Mishi. So I think this all is very fertile ground for continuing this conversation. I think one of the things that I wanted to ask, and really it's for anyone to respond to or to, and for you to respond to each other, one of the things that comes up a lot, including throughout this conference, is the sort of concept of both of algorithms and sort of how the algorithms that digital services use impact both our own abilities to express ourselves through these platforms, but also whether those algorithms are the protected speech of platforms, part of platforms' editorial decisions, or is something different from that that should be regulated because of its inaccountability. And so I know this is something that's coming up quite a bit in the legal context in the United States, but of course many other places around the world. So that may be starting with Jeff to where do we draw the line between an algorithmic system, a recommendation system, or a sorting system, and editorial discretion?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you asked about this because this has gotten a lot of confusion, including, unfortunately, among 3 appellate judges who issued a very bad ruling recently. So what the Supreme Court has essentially stated, there's debate about whether it was holding or dicta in the case involving those 2 must-carry laws that I talked about, was that the platform, at least for public social media, they sort of sent it back for a determination on direct messaging and so forth. But for public social media, their curation of content is First Amendment protected expression. And that makes sense because you think about the different online services, anything from the totally unmoderated garbage that you see to much more family-friendly services, and a platform's decision to either have these more stringent rules or to not have them is an expression about the type of community that it wants to create and that it is creating. So that makes sense. Now the challenge, and I think where we've had a lot of conflation recently, I talked about Section 230 being narrowed. And one of the ways that it has substantially been narrowed was a very recent decision by the Third Circuit in Philadelphia. It was a tragic case involving was something called a blackout challenge where children would do things to black out, including put things around their necks. And TikTok, at least according to the allegations in the complaint, TikTok algorithmically promoted these blackout challenge videos to teenagers, to even younger than teenagers. And so one girl tragically died after seeing one of these videos, and her family sued, saying that, yes, this was user content, but the algorithm is what we're suing over, the fact that TikTok put it on the For You page. And Section 230 does not say algorithms are excluded. Section 230 says that if you're a provider or user of user-generated content, you're not treated as the publisher or speaker. And what the court did was it basically said, well, because of this recent Supreme Court case, we're going to say that it is the platform speech, the algorithm is the platform speech, and therefore Section 230 doesn't apply. There's a petition for the court to rehear it en banc. I think it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and I think it could really determine the fate of Section 230 as well as the fate of the use of these algorithms. Because think about, if algorithms are excluded from Section 230, what will the platform start doing? And I don't see how they operate a modern platform without using algorithms. So I think that could be very dangerous, but I think that's really, I think that might be the next big Supreme Court case that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in Europe, there's an interesting paradox, say, because particularly since a few years ago, the European policymakers, legislators have been pushing, including via legislation, for the use of algorithms. And algorithms were seen as the solution to all the problems. And this is the European perspective. I wondered, maybe because there were some lobbyists representing certain companies that went to see policy or lawmakers saying we have the solution. No? Because otherwise it's difficult to explain, for example, well, the famous copyright directive that basically forces platforms to use algorithms to make sure that a piece of content does not violate copyright even before it is uploaded. There's a regulation on terrorist content online that basically forces platforms to implement system that is to say algorithms to make sure that a piece of content that has been labeled as terrorist is not uploaded again. So again, you really need to use algorithms. There's a decision by the court in Luxembourg in the case, what I call the case of the Austrian politician whose name I cannot pronounce, versus Facebook, the class, whatever, you know what I'm talking about. Where basically the court said, no, it's okay for an authority, a national authority, to impose a platform the obligation to take down a piece of content and other identical or similar pieces of content that are considered to be defamatory. Well, this clearly forces platforms to use algorithms again. So, I mean, these, because at the beginning, I mean, a few years ago, there was this discussion also in European courts on the very difficult distinction between active platforms and passive platforms. No? But now with these changes, I mean, what I see is that platforms are encouraged to a certain extent to be active, to actively use algorithms, and even, I mean, also within the context of the DSA to use algorithms, for example, to tackle systemic risks. I think that this is also very clear. On the other hand, we also need to admit or to say that the DSA also contains interesting provisions when it comes to algorithmic transparency, which is something new, interesting, and I think that we should commend that, no? But and also the fact that the DSA introduces some sort of a good Samaritan principle for the first time also seems some sort of an encouragement to the use of algorithms. So from the EU perspective, there's this apparent encouragement of the use of algorithms to deal with perhaps the most difficult areas where decisions are to be taken. But to make things even more complicated, we also have the AI Act. And there also we have, I would say, an algorithmic dimension from a different point of view, from the point of view of risks. And also there are many things at the intersection between DSA and AI Act that are still not clear in terms of implementation. And there's another element. What about liability deriving from algorithms that are put in the hands, let's say, that are offered to users to create content? And there's there's a project of AI liability directive that may try to kind of cover this difficult area. But let's not forget that. I mean, that it's not about algorithms, the use of algorithms to moderate content, but also now the discussions about the use of AI in general to create content in cases where this algorithm is provided to the user by the platform itself. No?
And this is something we're going to get into in detail in the next panel as well. Mishi, did you want to come in on this, or?
I mean, I think there's so much distrust of human beings, and of course the amount of content which was being uploaded, it's just impossible. I think Jeff is absolutely right. We cannot expect the platform companies not to be using automated mechanisms and also rely on technology to do whatever is expected of them to do. AI now is a term, often refers to Gen AI, but many other things which has been coming. But I want to see it more from a I would say India came up with 3 different advisories on AI and then withdrew all of them because none of them work. But to the case which Jeff pointed out, I'm in total agreement about the analysis here. But I think if we zoomed out a little bit, 2 years ago, I do not know how many of you actually knew about OpenAI or how much of the world knew about it. I also don't know how much we had woken up to the fact that the Surgeon General is now telling us that the rate of suicides amongst our children is increasing because of what usage is on social media. When that comes out in the society, then our laws, which cannot legislate for every possible condition or every possible scenario, they are going to be stretched and challenged. And if the technology is going to move at this scale, and now we are also coming to realize what this behavior collection, this data which has been fed to us for so many years, has done to our societies, our brains, then at least the desire from the society is do something. And that's why they go to court and say, like, do something here. And when we say, yes, this is correct, for 230, we can't exclude this, but then they're like, then change the law, because I need something to be done, because I'm seeing the things, facts are being made on ground. This is exactly, in 2014, people were being lynched because of messages on WhatsApp. There was actual lynching in 2014 in India because misinformation was floating rampantly on WhatsApp. But because this is India and not in America, so it wasn't taken very seriously. And that time, misinformation was not so big. Later on, it did become big, and then were a lot of changes that were made. But what at that time also we were struggling with, that facts on the ground are now telling us that the tech plus its usage is moving much faster than our regulators or our laws can catch up. That's why there is so much of tension, and everybody's figuring it out that governments want power. Power is derived from money, and the companies are doing something, and people are like, we don't understand what's really going on. And that's why all of the things which we work on become so difficult and also complicated in how we think about the free speech crisis, or when people want to call a lot of things about First Amendment. I think that's the North Star, but because it has been used, abused, and then also presented in complicated forms based on who the person talking was, we're really like, what do we do now?
Yeah, so if I could just say, I fully agree. I think that having the law catch up with technology is always a challenge. We have very few privacy laws. One of the few privacy laws we have involves videotape service providers, because people were concerned about a Supreme Court justice nominee's video rental records being obtained in the 1980s, and that's still on the books. So I completely agree. I think a lot of these challenges, both in terms of the harmful content as well as the fears of over-moderation and bias moderation, have really driven what I have seen in the United States as a lack of full appreciation for the North Star, for the First Amendment, and the values that for the past half century the First Amendment has really embodied. So you see, and I'm of course only speaking for myself, but if you see a politician talk about fire in a crowded theater to justify regulating hate speech and misinformation, that's something that obviously gets a lot of attention, but it happens all the time. You also have on the other side politicians saying we need to regulate these platforms more and force them to carry speech, or say they have to carry this type of speech. And I think that when I said at the beginning that the current state is not great, but it could be worse, I think getting worse could be very precipitous, and it could happen very quickly if you have politicians or leaders on both sides really failing to remember why we have this very strong interpretation of the First Amendment. We have two Supreme Court justices who have called for revisiting New York Times versus Sullivan, which is one of the most important First Amendment cases of the past century. So I feel like when things are okay right now, I think that just sort of all of these challenges, I think, might be driving a fairly fast reconsideration that I think could be pretty dangerous in the United States.
Another, I think, tendency that I think Joan alluded to earlier, which I think is happening in conjunction with those trends in the United States, is as companies comply with regulation like the Digital Services Act, like the UK's Online Safety Act, as well as similar regulation in places like Singapore and Australia. Daphne Keller, you mentioned, law professor at Stanford, has written just a piece this week in Lawfare on the complianceization of content moderation and trust and safety, that where what used to be, or in a, in the positive light, decisions that were made sort of from a free expression perspective, perhaps, maybe not with as much thought all the time, but is now becoming something that has to be documented and audited, and what are the impacts of that on expression if we are turning these decisions, which have an enormous amount of consequence for people's ability to express themselves, into a almost industrial scale compliance function.
No, I would say that also I think that Daphne at some point talks about the industry of compliance. No? It has become a business to provide services, because sometimes companies may outsource services to a third party when it comes to safely complying with applicable regulations. And this means not only the DSA, but also the legislation in countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, etc. And this also has an effect, which is the globalization of a certain way of moderating content. Because companies at some point say, okay, let's apply this at the global level so that we avoid, operating in different ways in different markets. And this clearly has an impact on the way, of course, speech can be disseminated through platforms in the United States, where the standards would be completely different from the European Union. But the other thing is that I think also that we need to mention, and this affects particularly European industries, is that these are entry barriers. No? Because, of course, if you want to become a big platform, now the kind of investments that you may need in terms of to guarantee compliance, it's huge. So to have new entrants, it will be even more and more complicated, no? And also even smaller platforms will be tempted not to grow too much, because basically all these regulations are thought to be applied to big platforms, no? Of course, there are other pieces of the DSA that apply to other platforms, but basically regulators, the Commission, all of us, when we talk about the DSA, we basically talk about the parts of the DSA that refer to big platforms. No? So these kind of asymmetries, this kind of huge costs that may also promote the dissemination of harmful content, because platforms will have to focus on compliance, on, let's say, filling papers instead of dealing with things that are really problematic, but they will need to dedicate resources to this. So all this has very, very negative effects, and moreover, some sort of a centralization of the moderation of speech. Yesterday, I think it was Jacob who was mentioning, also René, I think this idea of middleware, decentralization. Now with laws like the DSA, like Online Safety Act, etc., this is becoming more and more utopian, because, these kind of laws are promoting a centralized system of content moderation in order to comply. No?
So I want to make sure we save time for questions, and so we will open this up to audience questions in just a moment. But I think want to use my right as a moderator to ask one more question of the group, which is going back to the idea that I think concern about what happens when these decision-making about the regulation of online platforms and what that means for expression happens between governments and companies behind closed doors. So what are the things that civil society, that academics, that those of us who are not inside companies, not inside governments, but are concerned with what goes on between them, what is the role for civil society at this particular moment?
I think advocating for transparency and having, and obviously there's very nuanced issues about the types of contacts that government and platforms could have. But I think at the very least, having, and this would have to be done through legislation, I think, having legislation that says, okay, if there are going to be these contacts, then have it publicly documented so the public could see. So I think that would be the great first step.
Just to briefly mention that the DSA also contains some provisions, promoting the involvement of civil society, experts, academia. For example, they can be designated trusted flaggers. There are some areas where the European Commission is supposed to work with civil society organizations when it comes to the adoption of certain procedures or certain decisions following certain procedures. And also there's a provision that grants limited access to researchers, for researchers to data in the hands of platforms. But these are precisely the provisions in the DSA that still need to be properly implemented, and where we see some level of reluctance from the European Commission to fully implement them. So far, yeah, it's good we have them in Europe, but they are still not really much in practice.
This is a great panel. We agree on everything. But I'm going to say this is all, I agree with it, but I'm going to throw out a different idea here. Mostly, I spend a lot of time in the open source community where people are building projects on technology without which these platforms won't be possible today. I think all of these things are proceeding on the assumption that these are the platforms we have to fix them because that's what everyone uses. I really think if you're talking about what the civil society should be doing, I agree. We need more transparency, we need more researchers. But we also know that one day they feel like, then Facebook will deny the research the access to its data. The second day Elon Musk decides, okay, I'm buying this, and now these are the people I will re-platform, these are the people I will de-platform. Today, blocking rules change. I do think as civil society, we like technology. We want to share pictures with each other. We want to be able to even share nudes if we want to. We want to be able to talk to our families. We want to have one-to-many conversations, challenge our politicians. But that's the technology we currently have is not the technology we want. We want something which is not collecting our behavior all the time, showing us advertisement all the time, and then telling us this is the only way, and now we have also figured out this deal with all your governments, and we will decide that this looks fine. Now we have also recorded what we took down. We have a report. We hired Deloitte and Ernst & Young, and please audit it. So now, and why this has happened is because we've had 20 years of all of it, or since 2007, almost 20 years. But so this system has been perfected. As civil society, I would want us to think a little more radically. Internet was made for peer-to-peer and decentralized structures, federation, and not for centralization where few people sitting wherever they are sitting. Today they are in America, tomorrow they could be somewhere else. And they are the ones who can control all our means of communication in exchange of complete transparency of us, of our data. And that's not the technology we want. We want a net which works for us, and the governments need to be working for us. And I'm just a little tired of if it's for free, you are the product thing. And I think we need to demand a little more of this is not the structure we like. We can have a different structure, and there's enough talent that we can build different things. So as much as I would like all of this, because that's the right thing to do, I want us to look a little further ahead, because otherwise we are going to be told, well, climate change is going to happen, what Eric Schmidt said, but let's just buy nuclear power so that we can build more AI. So that's the direction we will all be moving towards, and we shouldn't be taking that as a given.
All right. Well, in the spirit of transparency and decentralization, now we can turn the session over. We have microphones, and so welcome questions. And we'll start on this side, and we'll take, I think, 2 or 3, and then let the panel respond, and try to be brief since we're short on time.
Sure. So it's a question for Joan. You mentioned the opportunity for the DSA to potentially be abused, and also the Brussels effect. I want to talk about, or ask about, the recent incident of Thierry Breton, famously writing that an American businessman trying to talk to an American president about an American election, somehow it was responsible on him to mitigate properly, or else the EU would take action. Now, he was let go. He's spending more time with his family now. But what's stopping the EU and the next EU commissioner from doing that? It seems like there's a lot of wiggle room here, and for a system that's supposed to be a systematic set of rules for governing content or for governing platform governance, seems kind of open to very significant abuse of American political speech, not to mention political speech around the world.
Let's take the two more, yeah.
So really quickly, Mishi, I really liked your point about the sort of political economy of this, that there's all these pressures driving it. And Jeff, you mentioned New York Times versus Sullivan. So we had these traditional media gatekeepers, you could call them that, in a different era who were fierce defenders of the First Amendment. And now they seem quite antagonistic to the structure of speech that we have now, where there's obviously the ability for many individuals to speak in a way that was impossible 50 years ago. So what do you, I mean, I think the New York Times even ran an op-ed the other day saying the First Amendment's out of control. So when you guys think about the political economy and the pressures that are happening here, where are these traditional defenders of the First Amendment now when it's sort of inconvenient to their business model to defend the First Amendment rights of other companies?
Understanding that there's no such thing as being a little bit pregnant, I'm curious whether anybody among the four of you on the stage can identify, with respect to Section 230 of the Communications Act, can identify the slightest tweak or the smallest change, even an easy one if there is such a thing, rather than simply digging the heels in, which a lot of people do, and say any change will, begin the landslide toward stifling of free speech. Is there anything you'd buy?
Okay, let's do those, and then we will get to you as well. But let's be brief in our responses to maximize the question, the Q&A.
Yeah, about Breton, I don't know, the implementer in chief or something. I mean, the chief implementer, something like that. I think he put that on his Twitter profile. I think that the original sin was the decision of the legislator to establish the European Commission as the regulator. There was here a bad experience with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, because then let's say the Irish Data Protection Authority became the European Data Protection Authority because most companies were based in Ireland. And I said, well, that's too small. I mean, if we put this at the local level or at the national level, I would say that the regulator is the country of establishment regulator. This regulator will be overwhelmed and we will have Ireland regulators dominating Europe. We need to find a better solution. No, and the better solution was the European Commission becoming the regulator. But the standards of the European Commission when it comes to regulators say that regulators should be independent and non-political. So in this sense, the European Commission is violating its own standards by accepting this role as independent, as regulator. Because when, for example, assessing regulatory bodies in countries that are candidates to join the European Union, in many cases say, your regulator is not independent enough, it's very political, no? And now they happily assume. The other thing is also that I have to say that Breton went far beyond the DSA, the provisions of the DSA. He hugely misinterpreted the powers that the DSA gave to the European Commission. And probably the problem is that, of course, perhaps in the strange structure of the European Union, perhaps we don't have the checks and balances. It was basically a political check and balance that was applied to him, and Ursula von der Leyen got rid of him, but that was the check and balance. But yeah, that was clearly dysfunctional.
Okay, so in terms of changes to Section 230, there is a typo in Section 230, so I'd like to change that. In addition to that, we don't have enough time to go into it, but basically, if there's a lawsuit between the subject of a post and the person who posted it, that's not covered by Section 230. There was a California court that basically said that that if it's adjudicated to be defamatory, the platform doesn't have to honor takedown notices because of Section 230. I disagree with that, and I think that Congress could clarify that without really changing the real impact of 230. In terms of appreciation for New York Times versus Sullivan, I'll just tell a very quick story. Right before the Fox Dominion case ended up settling, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times defending New York Times versus Sullivan, which was a really cool experience. And they put the headline, it was about this, I might be getting it wrong, but what protects Fox News also protects democracy. And I will tell you, just do not read the comments section with that headline. But what I learned is that there really is a lack of appreciation from, depending on how, for the First Amendment from people who should have stronger principles on it.
Mishi, so we are now at time, but let's just take one more question. We can push it because I'm moderating the next panel, so I can be late for myself. So we'll have your question, have a quick last word maybe.
Is there any research or modeling now on the future of tech that will not depend on user data and behavior as currency or as the commercial model? Is there?
Mishi, I think that one's to be for you.
I mean, there's a lot of projects that are going on in the world, obviously, which have different revenue models. But I do not know if there's like a research model which says, okay, this is, I think there are optional revenue streams. That's how we came up with subscription models for very many things. They don't always work in the same way. Talking about New York Times, you buy a subscription, they're still trying to show you ads and taking your data. But I would say that in terms of alternate revenue models, more new things are definitely emerging. And at least in the open source world, every day we are seeing different projects which are not just taking up user data and then doing the same advertising model. And I could point you to those things. And that's like across board. It's not just for this. It's also, some of them are, of course, it's a mixed bag. A Mastodon or a Blue Sky doesn't have the same kind of a reach as perhaps even the current broken X has. And, as we have seen that Google with 90% of the search market still is getting challenged by OpenAI and Perplexity. So of course there are going to be new things which are going to come up, and I'm hoping that happens across platforms.
So with that, please join me in thanking our panel.